Good evening, everyone, and welcome to NUITEQ Snowflake's latest in its series of webinars. Tonight, we have Danielle Macklin once again, and she'll be speaking on designing project-based learning scenarios using NUITEQ Snowflake. As always, if you have any questions, please put those questions in the questions tab, and I will interrupt Danielle at an opportune time to ask further questions and let her respond.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm super excited about this webinar. I really enjoyed when I was teaching using project-based learning and incorporating those type of scenarios in my own classroom. And I'm excited to share with you how you can use NUITEQ Snowflake to incorporate that in your classroom as well. So I want to begin first by sharing with everyone a little bit of information about what project-based learning means. So project-based learning is based off of this idea that students solve real-world problems or answer complex questions. So when we say real-world problems, it could still be connected to the content that they're learning, but it's something that is a little bit more meaningful, it's more authentic, and more engaging for those students. So typically the students would research or identify a real-world problem and then provide evidence-based solutions to that problem. And then often that presentation is a multimedia type presentation. So when using project-based learning, some of the benefits to that are students develop critical thinking skills as well as the content knowledge. So the difference with project-based learning is you're teaching the content material, whether it be key concepts or skills, through the learning of an actual project along the way. And it also helps with students furthering those 6C skills. So you have critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creativity, citizenship or culture, and then character education and connectivity. So they have an opportunity while they're learning the content knowledge to further those skills as well. So with project-based learning, one of the big questions that's often asked about it is what's the difference between a project, a standalone project, and a project-based learning experience? So, and this is the very short elevator pitch of kind of explaining the difference between the two. So with a project, it's short. It's usually after a unit of study. And typically the students are going to be completing the same task. So for example, in my classroom, when I taught 7th grade, I taught about the Civil War, and I would have at the end of a short unit about Civil War generals, I had the students create a fake social media reflecting those particular generals. So maybe it was General Sherman or General Lee or General Grant, and they had to create like a fake Twitter or fake Instagram. So all of the students had that same task they had to complete with the same criteria of what they needed to include, and it was after they had already learned about those people. With project-based learning, students are learning the content standards and the skills through solving a driving question. These questions are usually open-ended and are based off of finding a solution to a problem. So they're very inquiry-driven. They're not based off of having kind of the previous content knowledge. Instead, students learn that knowledge along the way. And then typically at the end of a project-based learning experience, students have something that they're going to present to a more authentic or real-world audience. So as opposed to maybe presenting just to their classmates, they might present something to people within their community, be it at the school or local community, or an organization that's related to kind of the content that you're teaching. So when incorporating project-based learning, it can seem like a very daunting task. I know that in my experience, I had 2 different ways that I did project-based learning. I did a Genius Hour with my 8th graders one year, and then I also did a Choose Your Own Final. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it was a big task. It felt like it was going to be really big, but the benefits for my students in the long run were really great. My advice for anyone who's interested in trying to incorporate project-based learning in their own classroom is to start small. So typically a long project-based learning unit would be anywhere from like 3 to 4 weeks. So most of the class time would be exclusively for doing that. If you're starting off new and not as familiar with how to do this, then you definitely want to start small. You want to limit the scope, so limit kind of the range of what they're doing, limit the amount of time. So maybe keep it between 2 weeks, 3 weeks at the absolute max, and then limit the learning targets. So focus that on what specifically are you trying to get your students to learn through the project itself. Project-based learning also needs to have a driving question. These questions need to be open-ended, they need to be engaging, and they need to allow students to ask further questions. That's going to drive forward their research. So it would be posing a problem, and students would need to solve that problem, or they would need to be able to answer a particular question. And the way that students would learn is they're going to learn that content through the research around that driving question. So if your question is maybe a question about how could you make the school more environmentally friendly, the students would have to research different environmental practices. They would have to research sustainability, renewable resources. So they would learn along the way, and then they would take that discovery and create a project or a presentation based off of that. Project-based learning also has a lot of backward design. So it's a lot of front loading for the teacher at the beginning, and that's mostly just to organize the materials, narrow down the research. I found in my own experience that if I were to just tell my students, go look it up, go to Google, go to the library or media center and see what you can find, my students didn't know where to begin. But if I could narrow down and tell them, go to these specific websites, or let's read together this particular article, or let's look at this museum compilation of resources. If we could kind of to just shrink it down into a manageable size, it made it a lot easier for my students as they were doing their research. Same thing with organizing, what tools do I need? Usually in my classroom, if I were asking my students to do something that was project-based, I tried to make sure that I had the materials they needed in order to complete the task. So tools that might be digital tools, it might be physical things that they would need if they were building something or making something or creating something. It would also be the people in my school that students could go to for extra mentorship or advice. So kind of different experts within my school. It's also important that as you're backward designing to make sure that you understand what you want your targets to be, the level of rigor that you want to start with your students, and then making sure that it is authentic. Make it something so that it is relevant to their experience. I taught social studies, so for me, it was kind of easy to always take the things we were learning in history and reflect it back for my students. But really, this could be done with any topic, any subject area, making it something that they're familiar with. And I'll show examples of that in just a moment. The other part is incorporating student choice and student voice. This would be being able to make sure that students have options for how they're going to learn and the final product that they may produce. I found that it worked best in the beginning to limit their choice and their voice. So maybe instead of saying you can do anything, you can research this in any way, say you can create this project using one of 5 different methods. So maybe you want to do a Google slide or a poster or a speech or a video or whatever it is, limit it down so that the students have something to choose from. They're not overwhelmed by too many choices, but they'll have something that they can pick that would work best for their learning needs. I know that this is a lot so far, so if at any point you do have questions, go ahead and put those in the chat and Jack will relay them to me. So we're going to talk some different examples of how to do project-based learning. And then I'll show a lesson activity also of how you could use this in your classroom as well. Now I did just the 4 core subjects. I know that there's so many more out there. There's so many other ways that you could tie this together and that you could do cross-curricular activities. But to keep it simple, I just did the first 4 main subjects. So an example of a project-based learning scenario is having students solve a problem of maybe invasive species. So looking in their community at maybe an invasive plant or an animal, and then doing research on why that animal or plant is a problem and what could be done to mitigate those problems, and then offering a proposed solution to that problem. So it'd be a really great way to incorporate biology skills and research skills for students in science. For students in math, a really fun way to incorporate project-based learning in a geometry class would be having students design a house. And I'll share that in a lesson activity that I put together to explain that in a little bit more detail. For ELA, you could have students do project-based learning about reimagining a social media platform. This would be a really great way to incorporate a lot of 21st century skills and a lot of skills related to digital citizenship, and having students evaluate the different social media that they're all super familiar with. I think every kid's probably on TikTok or on YouTube or on Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, all the other stuff. So they could examine the qualities and characteristics of those platforms and then try to reimagine what could they create that would maybe solve a problem related to social media. And then lastly, social studies. So one idea would be have students research what a particular person from history might say about a former or a current social issue. This would give students an opportunity to learn more about different people in history, about the time period that that person had been alive, if they're not still alive, and also tie it into a social issue. So it's a really great way to kind of have that connectivity within the subject itself. Now, the fun part of using Snowflake. So that was a lot of how to do project-based learning and what it is and how it operates. But there's also different ways that you can use Snowflake to make that a lot easier so that it doesn't seem like such a daunting, overwhelming task. And I do have examples from when I was teaching how I used Snowflake when I introduced some of my own project-based learning in a classroom. One way would be to use lesson activities to introduce the entire project-based learning unit itself. So for example, when I taught my middle schoolers, my 8th grade students, we did a Genius Hour for the last quarter of the school year. And my students didn't have any experience with what a Genius Hour is. And I had narrowed the scope. I told them, doesn't have to be related to history, but it has to be you're learning something and you're learning a skill and you're going to demonstrate whatever it is that you've learned. So to introduce that whole concept of what it meant, I had students thinking about their own interests. And we used a cards lesson activity. This is, I believe, on the community. So if you search Genius Hour, you should be able to find that. And my students use this as brainstorming prompts. So just to get them first introduced to the idea of project-based learning with the Genius Hour, we use the cards to discuss, and then my students, we have our little thought bubbles for each of the kind of main topics of those cards. I gave my students an opportunity to write down and just kind of free thought everything onto a piece of paper. And then the fun part was I just let them shout it out, and I did my best to try and keep up and write as much as I could, as quickly as I could, so that students could. Yes.
I'm sorry, I thought you were going to break. I apologize. I do have a question that came in asking, could you explain what a Genius Hour is again?
Yes. Oh, I love Genius Hour. Genius Hour, or sometimes it's called 20% time. 20% time was based off of a Google the corporate world of workers getting 20% of their work week to work on their own passion projects. For my students, I used the terms Genius Hour and Passion Project interchangeably. It is an opportunity for students to really guide their own learning. It's to discover something that they're interested in. For my students, since it was my first time trying it, I really just wanted to kind of give it a go and see what they would come up with. And I had no boundaries of what they could do. So I had students who were really interested in learning a language that hadn't been taught at my school. So my students came up with a plan to how to learn a particular language. So I had some students who, through the beauty of YouTube, were able to teach themselves basic phrases in ASL. I had students who did Japanese, a student who was trying to learn Welsh because her family was going to do a trip to Wales the following spring. I had students who wanted to learn how to build certain things, so they did woodworking. I had a student who wanted to learn how to do a backflip, so he came up with a plan to how to teach himself to do a backflip and put together the resources he would need for that, get the permissions from our PE department to use certain materials to practice during that. I had a student who wanted to bake cakes and decorate cakes, which I loved because that meant I got to sample all the things he was bringing in. But really, it's an opportunity to give students a chance to figure out things they're interested in. So much of a school day, we tell them as teachers, this is what you have to learn, this is what we need to teach you. They have such limited opportunities to actually direct their own learning and find the things that they're interested in. So when we talked Genius Hour or Passion Project, it was really just giving them a chance to learn something that they might not have an opportunity to do. So I told my students the only resource I will provide them with is time. They had 1 day a week for 1 whole quarter where we didn't have an academic class. They had Genius Hour time, and they got to work on whatever it was they wanted to work on. And they had accountability. They had journals they had to do each week. They had to meet with me regularly, and kind of we talked their progress. We really worked out kind of some of the kinks with it. And I definitely had students who said, well, what if I don't do anything? What if I just sit here for the whole time? And I'm like, well, that's going to be a really boring 8 weeks for you. And then you're going to have to get up in front of your classmates and be like, I chose to do nothing for 8 weeks, but that's a choice you're going to make. And I can't control that. I'm just giving you time, and I will help you, try to focus on something you might be interested in, but ultimately it's on you. So my 8th graders, I think they did a really great job with it. I left the following year, so I didn't have an opportunity to do it again, but it was a huge learning experience with my students. And a lot of it was inspired too by having done a choose your own final with my other students in years prior, where in the similar idea, I had told my students, my 8th grade students, you're going to do a research project for your final. I don't care what it is, but it just has to be on something historical from 1850 until the present, which was the years that our curriculum covered. And we set up everyone did a research paper. They had the same guidelines for their paper. And then they had to come up with what they wanted to learn and what they were interested in. And they came up with some really amazing, kind of fun and thought-provoking and interesting things, because for even students who didn't like history or they didn't like social studies, they could find the one thing that they liked, and they were able to direct their learning and be really happy about learning something and then teaching the rest of the class about it. I hope that answered the question. I know that was a really long explanation of Genius Hours and 20% time. I would highly recommend, if you're interested in learning more about it, check out resources by AJ Giuliani. Really incredible ways on how to get started with Genius Hour and how to incorporate that even in a remote setting. So those would be resources I would look at. Back to Snowflake and how to use Snowflake to do project-based learning scenarios. So we had using lesson activities to introduce it. The other thing that I used in my classroom as a way to just keep students on target as we were going through our Genius Hour is we would use our polls feature. So I had on polls, I just had it opened with questions. I think I just numbered the questions 1 through 4 or 5, however many we were doing that day. And then I used a cards activity. I split my interactive panel into multiple zones. I'd flip over the cards, and then my students would use the text feature in polls to share how their project had been going, their successes, their failures, what they're learning. So just a way to hold them accountable, and also a way to really continue prompting discussion. So this would be a really great tool to use if you are incorporating project-based learning in your classroom as a way to get students answering some of those open-ended critical thinking questions. Other ways that you can use Snowflake is to curate and to direct their research. So one of the things that we really love about our lesson activities is it's a place to put all of your information in one spot. So, and I'll show that in the mock lesson activity I made for a math project-based learning. It's a place where you can add in your YouTube videos. You could have web links to open educational resources or resources that you've already vetted for your students, or even live Google Docs. You can add in your PDFs. So you can put everything in one spot and then share that with your students so that all the information they would need to help guide them forward in their learning would be in one place. The other way would be having students create their own lesson activities. So when using Snowflake, students, once you've set up your Snowflake account, your Snowflake classes, you have the ability to allow students to create their own lesson activities. So they could take everything that they had learned in their project-based learning and then share that with their classmates by building their own lesson activity using one of the 16 templates. They could use that to present to the front of the class. They could also share it into a group so that their fellow classmates could then go through and look at that information as well. So there's some examples of how to incorporate project-based learning into your own classroom. And to have it make a little bit more sense, I'm going to share just a short lesson activity that I built. Math is not my wheelhouse, so I went with something very basic on how to use project-based learning in a math scenario. So in this case, I have a building a dream house. So I'm going to play first, and then we'll go through with the edit and check out some examples of what I did. So for this lesson activity, I began by having a short little YouTube video.
Maths is all around us.
In which students would learn more about the relationship between math and architecture and how they're connected together. So this video is about 3 minutes long. My students would watch that at the beginning. After finishing that video, we won't watch it. My students now are going to see a PDF that I've put together of the instructions of what they would do as part of their project-based learning. So with this being a build your dream house, it has the background kind of task of what they would do. They're going to create a blueprint floor plan and a 3D scale model, staying within $1 million budget. So I have the directions of what students would need to do. So calculating the planning, there's the math part, calculating perimeter and area, researching the cost of supplies. So this would be really great for them to be able to understand how expensive things are in the real world. So you get that real world connection. You can use so many online resources to calculate the cost of lumber, the cost of tile for their floor, or the cost of a fancy chandelier or whatever. So then all of the furnishings and decorating of the home. And then as a teacher, I would have, had I taught math, provided them with the materials to do their 3D model. So you could do this digitally using a program like Tinkercad, or you could have it just be a paper graphing that students would work out. So as a teacher, kind of you can provide them with materials that you think would be relevant and appropriate. Or you could give them the option, do it on paper or do it in a digital format. So there, my PDF explaining what students would need to do. My students could print that, they could download and save it, and then it goes into the lesson activity itself. And with the geometry lesson activity, we have our instructions of what students would do. In this case, they have to calculate perimeter. They pull up the rulers to measure, and we can also see the numbers are there, so that helps a little bit too. And then they would put that information into the calculator. So they would have to measure each of the 1, 2, 3, 4 sides, add in that info, submit their answer, and then it'll show whether or not they were able to measure correctly using the ruler. And then we also have, let's see if I can skip to our questions about area. We can see different shapes. So it's a really great way for the students to practice their measuring ability. You're reinforcing those geometry concepts. So now they have measuring the area, calculating the area. So there we go. And then from my front loading backward design perspective of putting this together, so I've built the lesson activity. And then within the lesson activity info, We have the descriptions of what my students would do. We have our YouTube video. And then I also have a link to, I found a really great resource on OER Commons. I'm just going to open that up, that I used as my inspiration for creating this. And they had an entire lesson plan with the amount of instructions. OER Commons is a great resource, open educational resource. So everything on there is available for teachers to use. This was a really great lesson plan that I found, and we can see we have, this one's tied to Pennsylvania Learning Standards, but it also related to Common Core, and then all of the instructional plans related to that. So as a teacher, I could have all of that in one place. I could even use this as my directions for my students so that they could see the timeline of how we were going to incorporate this project-based learning into our classroom routine. And then we can see I have my Common Core standards tied to that as well. So all of this would be in one space for my students to use. This could be done, this just one little lesson activity could be used as part of a broader unit of learning for my students. So they would be learning these math skills while they're doing something fun, like building their dream house. And as a teacher, you can tie it into kind of their own real world experience by maybe showing little clips of, like, I mean, I always think of lifestyles and the rich and famous, but you could show little clips of like celebrities' homes and people that the students might understand and know about as a way to kind of inspire them of, what do you think goes into building these really crazy over the top houses? And would you be able to do that within that budget? So that is one example of how to use project-based learning within your own classroom. So I know that that was a lot of information. I'd like to take a moment, let it marinate a little if it needs to, and then open up for any questions that you may have for me about project-based learning versus a standalone project, or ways that you can incorporate Genius Hours, or even your choose your own final type ideas for your students.
So we do have one question from someone asking if we would be willing to do an inquiry-based learning presentation in the future.
Absolutely. I think that would be a really great topic. I would be on board with that.
Okay. So we will plan that, and we will put it out on the list of upcoming webinars as soon as we have it planned and ready to be published.
And I'm adding that to my notes now.
We would like to thank everyone for attending again this evening and welcome you back. Not next week. Next week is Thanksgiving, so we will not be here next week, but the following week we'll be back with another webinar. So thank you, Danielle. Have a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.